I think the problem in the United States is that Protestant evangelicals thought they owned the country, and it's becoming patently obvious they don't own it anymore if they ever did. And the temptation then is to think something's being stolen from you, that you're powerless in the face of this act of theft, and to despair. I think the preaching of hope, the preaching of the return of Christ, the preaching of the Lamb will triumph, I think these things have to feature.
Hello and welcome to Post-Christianity. My name is Glen, Scrivener.
And I'm Andrew Wilson.
We're trying to think about our cultural moment in historical perspective. How do we get where we are and what should we do about it? And we're very thrilled to have our guest on the podcast today, Carl Trueman. He's the author of many books, including The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World. And he joins us on the line now. Hello, Carl.
Hello, it's great to be with you guys.
So one of the things you say towards the end of your book, I think, is, I know it's a while since I read it, but I remember it making an impression on me, but words to the effect of, a lot of my goal in writing is to help explain the world to the church. So I'm trying to help the church understand where they are. Could you, as much as I know you'll have had to do this many times, could you summarize that narrative in 3 or 4 minutes? Like, so when you're saying there is basically something about modern selfhood and identity which feeds through into concepts of who I truly am, and also to our sexual politics, which is the result of a series of ideological changes that began in the late 18th century and have been refracted through particularly some key late 19th and early 20th century thinkers. But could you just give us a quick summary of that account, just so for people who haven't read it?
Sure. I think at the center of the thesis I'm trying to make is the idea that certainly in the way we experience reality, what has occurred over the last 400 or 500 years is that our inner feelings have been granted increasing authority in understanding who and what we are. Now, again, it's a little more complicated than that, of course, because the outer world shapes our inner feelings in significant ways. But subjectively, I think what we've experienced over the last 400 or 500 years is the idea that who I am is increasingly determined by who I feel myself to be, what I feel myself to be. And that tracks with, well, you could trace an intellectual genealogy. As I start with Rousseau, one could say that in Rousseau you get this move towards seeing culture as that which corrupts, culture as that which prevents me being myself, and therefore the real goal is to go back, to reflect on my inner life prior to culture getting hold of me and messing me up in order to find out who I am. So we get this authorization of the inner space, I think, in the 18th century in a way that we had not seen before. It's not that the inner space never existed. Clearly the psalmist explores inner emotions. You can read Homer and read about Achilles sulking. Clearly Homer has a concept of the inner space. But with the 18th century, the inner space takes on more importance in terms of who we are. And it's not just a non-Christian thing either. I'm struck by the fact that as Rousseau is writing his material exploring the inner space, you have, for example, Jonathan Edwards writing The Religious Affections. The 18th century seems to me to be a tipping point in terms of that exploration of the inner space, because emotions are becoming more authoritative. And then as we move closer to the present day, the big question becomes, why is sex so important? Why does sexual desire suddenly take on an importance in terms of identity that it's not had before? Again, sex is not invented in the 20th century.
How dare you?
You read Homer, and Homer makes sense because we all know we all know that one guy can fall in love with another guy's wife, run off with her, and the husband is mad and he chases after him. That sort of erotic dynamic is not something that is new in Western culture at all. But what we see in the 20th century is this idea that actually my sexual desires are some of the most foundational things for understanding who I am. So we get the emergence of the language of LGB or even of straight, where you think you describe yourself as straight, what are you doing? You're grounding your identity in the nature of your sexual desire. That's an interesting and relatively modern thing to do. So you have this authorizing of the inner space, I think, in the 18th century, and then by the time we get to the present day, that inner space has been colonized really by, above all, sexual desires. And that helps to explain, I think, both much of the politics we now struggle with in the West, but also, to bring this into a more Christian perspective, many of the pastoral issues that pastors and elders are having to deal with in their local church, because they have a generation of people rising who've been trained by the culture to think of their identity in terms of sexual desire. So this move, this authorizing and sexualizing of the inner space, I think transforms everything, both public life and pastoral life.
I guess your first real historical figure that you're analysing is Rousseau, which thrills Andrew's heart, who has been in the 18th century for the last few years working on his book. But if we're going to trace back the origins of the modern self, couldn't we trace it back a lot further? Descartes or Luther, or what about the mystics? What about Augustine? Are there further sort of prequels to the Enlightenment sense of the modern self that you could have had a look into?
Yes, I mean it's an obvious question in some ways. Why did you begin where you began? And it's the question that I think any historian faces when they write on any topic, because history doesn't begin at a certain point in time. There's always a backstory to whichever figure or whichever event or action you look at. So the choice of Rousseau was on one level relatively arbitrary. Could certainly have begun with Descartes, could have begun with Luther, could have begun with late medieval nominalism, could have begun with the mystics. Could go back to Paul and the exploration of the inner self there. I had one person email me asking me why I didn't start with Eve in the garden. Surely that was where the problem began. It was but the book needed to be less than 100,000 pages long. So it's a fair question. I think Rousseau is on one level an arbitrary starting point. On another level, I think a justifiable starting point, on the grounds that Rousseau does have a huge amount of influence, for example, on modern educational theory. So we can see his specific fingerprints on certain aspects of the modern world in which we now live. But certainly one could go back further. And I think as well, I'm speaking to you from the United States, I would also say the narrative I tell in some ways is a bit of a Western European narrative. I've been asked, why didn't you include Thoreau? Why didn't you include the Transcendentalists? I think there are a lot of players in the modern story, and really for the sake of keeping things concise and coherent, I started with Rousseau, and I try to trace a line through him, at the risk, of course, of some degree of simplification.
So one of the things we've talked a bit about in fact, quite a lot about on this podcast, is the way that you can account for the modern world as a series of sort of modifications of and exaggerations of, and then gradually removals, the foundations of Christian thought that basically becomes so normalized in society. The weak shall be made strong, and that actually you can tell almost the account of some of what's happening in Rousseau, certainly a lot of what's happening in Marx, probably less of what's happening in Freud, but a lot of then what's happening in the 20th century and our current political divides, through the lens of a sort of universalization of Christian values that make, we were just talking about in the previous episode about why we find fascism so much more reprehensible than communism, is because communism would sort of appeal to a Jewish, even the Magnificat and that sort of thing, whereas of course in fascism you don't. And I'm wondering to what, but of course your account is a more, if I can put it this, not a negative but it's a more negative account. It's a more sort of anti-Christian account of how we got to where we are with some of the political and moral and cultural divides we face. To what extent do you think that those two, if I can call them the Truman Doctrine and the sort of and Tom Holland's take, or and many others, to be honest, Glen and I have both been influenced by both. But to what extent do you think they're complementary accounts? To what extent do you think that there is actually a bit of that they are opposed in certain ways, that there are certain things you say, no, I think we disagree about this. I actually think that's an attempt to try and sanitize or Christianize something that is more fundamentally in opposition to Christianity than that?
Yeah.
Or would you see them as basically being just two different ways of telling a story and that we need both?
I'm inclined to think we need both. And I think there are some interesting aspects of the modern world that are... I mean, one of the things I do in class when I teach Rousseau is I'm conscious that students might well think that I'm teaching, Rousseau as a bad guy. In some ways, in my narrative, he does appear as a kind of villain. On the other hand, there are some things about Rousseau that I think are important contributions that Christians need to bear in mind. For example, Rousseau makes great play of the fact that morality has to be connected to sentiments and emotions. And I make the point to the students, if you look out the window and you see an old lady being beaten up by a gang of hooligans and you don't feel something, then we would say you're a psychopath and we would see you as morally deficient in some way. Secondly, I think what you get with Rousseau practically that you don't even find in the Reformers is the notion of universal human dignity. I mean, the Reformers, yes, they believed all human beings are made in the image of God, but they also knew that some human beings were just better than others. And, Calvin does not want ordinary people running Geneva. It's the aristocracy who are supposed to do that. And I think when you look at Rousseau, you get these glimpses of the truth that have been perhaps theoretically acknowledged in the past, but have not really leavened the whole way of thinking. Now, so first of all, there's that side of it, and I think some of the Enlightenment developments are actually Christian developments on that front. So what goes wrong? Maybe it's putting it rather simplistically, but I might put it this way and say we're now living in an era where the Christian rhetoric of justice, love, mercy, etc., persists, but the Christian anthropology that gave that rhetoric solid, stable content has disappeared. And that's where I think the real problem lies. So, yes, love, mercy, and justice, we all know these are good things. But if you don't have an agreed anthropology underlying them, then you really have no agreement on what they mean. And I think Alistair MacIntyre gets at this in his book After Virtue and some of his work after, where he points to, he talks in the language of meta-narrative. We've lost our narrative, and therefore these ethical terms that persist no longer have any agreed content. I would say yes, and the narrative we've lost actually is the anthropological one. We've lost... again, to put it in a broader terms, we've lost Christian doctrine while retaining Christian moral language. And I think that creates a lot of the problems we now see. That, yes, there is a sense in which modern society is parasitic on the best of Christian language. The tragedy is modern society no longer has the Christian underpinnings in order to give that language a stable content.
That makes a lot of sense, therefore, of why you began with Rousseau, I guess. Because, I mean, there is that sense of the inventing of the individual, to use Larry Seidentop's kind of term about how we even got to a Rousseau being able to make the statements that he makes. And you've got to have the inviolable dignity of individuals as individuals who, consent to be in the body politic and are equal before the eyes of the law. You need a whole lot of Christianity to get you to where Rousseau gets us, or to where Rousseau was. But then I guess that kind of denial of original sin is just massive, isn't it? What do you think it would take these days to retrieve original sin? How do we make original sin great again?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, and I've been very, as in a lot of things, I've been very influenced by Charles Taylor on many points. And one of the interesting observations Taylor makes about the modern world is, we make a mistake if we think the modern world is a straight fight between believers and unbelievers. Taylor says it's at least a three-way fight. You have believers, let's say Christians in our context. You have Christians. You have humanists, of which Steven Pinker would be a great example. And then you have what Taylor, I think, accurately dubs Nietzschean anti-humanists, of which Camille Paglia, one of my great heroes, would be, or is she a heroine? I don't know. But Camille Paglia would be a good example. And when you think about that setup, what's interesting is it depends what question you ask as to how the the sides line up. If you ask about the existence of God, then Pinker and Pallier are in one corner and Trueman's in another. If you ask about, does the universe have a moral structure, or can we talk about morality in meaningful, transcendent kind of terms, then Trueman and Pinker line up against Pallier. If you ask about, are human beings fundamentally sound? Is it just a question of better education that will make us better, or are we fundamentally dark and depraved? Then Trueman and Pallier line up against Pinker. And so I'm wondering if actually in the modern world we do actually have points of contact on the issue of sin and darkness and depravity with which we can work. I find Freud, for example, much of Freud quite compelling in terms of how he understands human nature. Now, obviously, he and I disagree. For him, that's nature. For me, it's fallen nature. But I do think there are points of contact with modern thought where evil is taken very, very seriously indeed. I don't know many people who don't believe in darkness and evil relative to human nature. We may disagree on exactly what its content is and its origins are, but I think in the world we live today, arguments about evil have a certain powerful plausibility to them.
Mm-hmm. So in the Rousseau part of the book, you're sort of talking about the self is psychologized. What is good about that? I mean, you talk about with your students, you don't paint Rousseau as the man in the black hat, because there's something good about individuals not being lost in the shuffle of the collective, isn't there? What's good about the self being psychologized?
Yeah, I think the rise of the self is a good thing on a number of fronts. I mean, one, as I've already mentioned, we do have feelings. We are not automata. We have feelings. A proper moral, ethical formation requires the correct attunement of those feelings. If I look out of the window and see that old lady being beaten up and it brings me intense pleasure, there's something wrong with me. So there's certainly that dimension to it. Secondly, and again, this perhaps is not so relevant to Rousseau, but it certainly tracks to the Reformation. One of the big... I was at Notre Dame a couple of weeks ago and Patrick Deneen came to the lecture I was giving, and I like Patrick Deneen's stuff, but Patrick Deneen does tend to blame... everything seems to go wrong, strange to tell, about 500 years ago, somewhere around about 1517. And on one level, I feel some of the pungency of Patrick Deneen's critique of modern liberalism, modern individualism. I do. On the other hand, I think that the rise of individualism is simultaneous with the rise of personal responsibility. And as a Christian, I cannot make sense of the New Testament unless there's a high degree of personal responsibility there. We are as individuals to repent and believe. We cannot have the priest or the church doing it for us. We have to do that stuff. Now, that brings with it a risk. It brings with it the risk of the kind of world we live in today. In the same way that I think freedom of religion is a good thing, but it inevitably shifts power towards the congregation, and inevitably in the modern world has made religion more of a consumer product than it would have been in the Middle Ages. But I still think freedom of religion is a good thing. So my answer, Glen, would effectively be, these are good things that are developing in some ways with Rousseau in the 18th century. But as with so many good things, they bring risks, they bring problems in their wake. I happen to think that the rise of the individual allows Christians to do more justice to more of the New Testament than the very strong corporatist, hierarchical notion of the church that one has in the Middle Ages.
So that raises to me quite an interesting question about complicity. on the part of the church, and I mean, I'm not just digging into the medieval period, because that would be, we've touched on that in previous episodes, and also I know it would be a bit like shooting fish in a barrel, the three of us, but perhaps in the more modern period. So if you were to talk about the period, I mean, a lot of your book is sort of, as I said, late 18th century to early 20th, and then with the implications really in public life in the last 50 odd years. Where and in what ways do you see the church as complicit in, and by the church I mean, evangelical Christians and people and adjacent to us, really, whether it comes to issues of sexual ethics, or of racial politics, and obviously racial history, of various of the cultural hot potatoes that we have now. It's obviously a bit like I know you've had this with other people have said to you, of course the things start to go wrong at 1517. How do we avoid almost doing the same thing of that with things start to go wrong in 1775 or whatever it is, and instead say, actually, no, there is an account here in which the church is part of that process. And so where would you see particular points at which the church is complicit in where we are, and other things even that you think, we just still need to repent of that, or get our heads around the fact that that's what we did?
Yeah, there are. I mean, numerous points. You talk about shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, this could still be a shooting fish in a barrel kind of moment. And I'm also conscious that one of the things one has to be wary of in this, it can be very easy to come across as a kind of, I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like other men. So I don't want to preface everything I'm going to say now with, I regard myself as being implicated in the problem. Hopefully, what I say will help people see the problem more clearly, but I'm certainly not saying, look at them over there, what a problem they've got. I mean, number of ways I think Christianity, and particularly Protestant evangelicalism, has connected with the problems that I have been pointing out over the last few years. I mean, one obvious one I think is worship. The prevalence of the first person singular in a lot of worship songs. The first person singular really emerges as a force, I think, in Montaigne, 16th century. That's where we start in literature to see the first person singular coming through in a strong way. Now, you get it in the Bible, of course, but typically in the Bible, when the psalmist uses first person singular, ultimately he brings himself under the covenant God, that his identity is ultimately grounded not in himself and his feelings, but in God's covenant dealings with Israel. Psalm 73 would be a good example. I felt really miserable about this, that, and the other. Then I went to the sanctuary and put all my personal feelings in the context of God's covenant dealings with Israel. Even Psalm 88, the most relentlessly depressing psalm of the whole Psalter, begins with the covenant name of God. So all of the agonies are ultimately brought under God's greater dealings. So I think the prominence we give to the first person in our church life, particularly in our worship, would be problematic. I think in terms of public issues, certainly I would put no-fault divorce right up at the top of church's complicity with the culture. I was just talking about this in class yesterday. It was the final class of the year. I know some of my students are going off to get married in the next month or two, and I was commenting to them that if you look at the traditional vows of marriage in the Book of Common Prayer and then put them side by side with the logic of no-fault divorce, you're not simply looking at two different versions of marriage. You're actually looking at two different anthropologies. It's two different understandings of what it means to be men and women, what it means to be human that underlie those. On the traditional vows, they arise out of a context of understanding human beings as being obliged and dependent. No man is an island. We are all connected. We have obligations and dependencies, and those are the things that define us throughout our lives. If you look at no-fault divorce, you have that kind of radical, liberal, individual anthropology that a man like Patrick Deneen, I think so rightly, pinpoints and rails against in his writings. That's two different versions of what it means to be a human being. Now, think of how, did the church take a stand on no-fault divorce? I don't think so. Does the church typically discipline people for getting divorced? In my experience, not frequently. Yes, we'll get very hot under the collar about gay marriage, But the problem with gay marriage really rests upon the anthropology that lies behind no-fault divorce. So I would say we've been complicit morally on the way that we have downgraded and degraded marriage on that front. And then I think there's the more, it's harder to pin down, but I think we're all subject to this. We tend to take our membership vows in church very lightly. You know, the minister does something we dislike and we up sticks and go to another church down the road. During my own time as a pastor, we had, I think, 3 discipline cases, all of which for pretty serious issues. And in each case, the individual who's excommunicated simply went off to another church and joined it or worships there. Now, those are extreme cases, but I think many of us, and I include myself in this, feel that temptation to walk away as soon as our church isn't scratching the need that we feel. It takes a significant degree of self-discipline, I think, to resist that urge. So I would say in the whole area of church commitment, again, it goes to that comment I made earlier about freedom of religion. Love freedom of religion, but it creates the marketplace of religion that means that we are vulnerable to treating the church as we might treat a squash club or a golf club or something like that. It becomes the thing that we join that connects with us. And traditionalists like me often point the finger at contemporary worship people and say, oh, they're just going there because they like the contemporary songs. Well, traditionalism's an aesthetic too. There's a reason I go to a traditionalist church. I like the old hymns. Yeah, and I could make a theological case for them, but I'm conscious that when I do that, in part, I'm justifying a position I hold for other reasons as well. So I think we're all at some level, corrupted might be too strong a word, but perhaps tempted, tilted by this individualist, consumerist kind of culture in which we now find ourselves.
Which is very much enabled by technology, isn't it? And you've written very persuasively about how the invention of the motor car has absolutely changed the dynamics, and perhaps more than the sort of a philosophy of freedom of religion has. And I wonder whether technology shocks can play into the narrative here. When you talk about the self has been psychologized and psychology has been sexualized, and certainly we feel the effects of that today. But somebody like a Mary Harrington will point to the impact of industrialization and the fact that the domestic realm and the work realm have been split apart by all sorts of just economic factors, and there is the invention of the motor car, and then you come through into the 1960s and there's this thing called contraception, which absolutely, splits sex from any of its consequences, or so the story goes anyway. So how are we going to fit together the technological and the industrial and the economic, the material causes from the ideas that are filtering down? Yeah,
it's a very good question. I mean, my book is in large part a sort of intellectual genealogy on that front. And the reason I did that was I think it's helpful to look at the intellectuals, because they are the ones who reflect on what's happening and allow us to see very clearly the implications. But of course, most people are not living the way they do or thinking the way they do because they've read Rousseau or Descartes or Wilhelm Reich or Sigmund Freud. It's the technology, it's the world in which we live that shapes how we think. And I think Mary's, I think her book, Feminism Against Progress, is an amazing contribution. I actually did a review of it for a feminist website. I sort of broke the glass ceiling, I think, at fairer disputations as the guy who did a review. But I think Mary's book is fascinating and I think profoundly true in a lot of its analysis. How do we break free of this? Well, I think there are two big problems here. First of all, there's what the German critical theorist Hartmut Rosa calls social acceleration. And that's the phenomenon of, well, when you think about the Reformation, one technological development, the printing press, takes Europe 150 years really to assimilate the impact of the printing press, how it reconfigures structures of power, how it changes life for everybody. I was teaching Pilgrim's Progress this week to students. I was saying, isn't it interesting in Pilgrim's Progress how all the gentlemen that Bunyan refers to, all the wealthy people, they're all bad people. And at the heart of Pilgrim's Progress, the scene of supreme kind of problem and evil is Vanity Fair, the commerce that's sort of tearing Bunyan's world apart. Well, all of that tracks back to the impact of the printing press in some way. Well, when you think the printing press creates 150 years of bloody conflict in Europe, what do you do in a world like ours where we are getting technological developments, I would say not every week, but certainly every 6 months or so, that potentially revolutionize everything? Suddenly, I'm having to talk about ChatGPT at work. I'm a guy who uses his cell phone I keep it switched on silent, so it's a mobile voicemail, and I order books from Amazon and that's what I do on my cell phone. Suddenly, we got ChatGPT. Well, that's not going to be the last thing that hits the shore. And what Rosa points out is that when you live in a world of continual technological developments, you live in a world of continual disturbance, that you can never settle. You can never grab hold of something that is solid in order to know who you are and how you relate to the wider world. And that's a problem for us all. We can't simply step aside from technology. We are caught up in this flux at this point. And the second point flowing from that is in general terms, technology, we can't avoid it. I'm sympathetic to Rod Dreher's notion of the Benedict option. Formation of strong communities, yes, but we fool ourselves if we think we can form our strong communities in isolation from the technological developments that are taking place. When I was a pastor, and Andrew, I'm sure you have the same experience, Andrew, my congregants have mortgages. I have a mortgage myself. They have student loans. They are inextricably tied into the world in such a way that they cannot simply and straightforwardly withdraw from it to form a strong community. So we have unavoidable technology and we have terribly disturbing social consequences. Disturbances caused by technology. How do we counteract that? I don't know that we can do it in the short term. Now, there are, I think, glimpses of light. Oddly, I think COVID provided some hope here. In that I was struck when we went online for 6 weeks at Grove City College. And I remember speaking to one of my colleagues and saying, we've got to pray that the students hate it. This could be the moment the barbarians storm the gates kind of thing. And the thing was, the students hated it. Ultimately, they don't pay their student fees to be taught by me. They pay their student fees to be on a campus with other bodies. They pay to be in a classroom with other bodies. I think COVID has opened up potential conversations about the importance of actually being present with people. Having said that, one thing that disturbed me was it was not so much that churches went online. It was chaos in the early days. Nobody knew what was happening. It seemed to me a prudent thing to do, to go online. The fact that so few people thought that they lost very much when we did that disturbed me. Yes, we got to do it, but let's feel it's painful. Let's feel it's horrible. Let's be working as hard as we can to get back to normal as soon as possible. The fact that that was not a strong impulse worried me. And again, going back to Mary Harrington, I think one of the things Mary Harrington really pinpoints in her book is the importance of the body, the importance of the authority of the body. That's another way, I suppose, of telling the kind of narrative I'm told. What is psychologizing? Psychologizing involves ultimately a downgrading of the body to some extent. I think we need to try to teach and impress upon people the importance of embodiment. How do we do that? I think as Christians, we do that through hospitality. More than anything else, hospitality. I don't remember many classes at college. I do remember being invited to professors' houses for dinner. The names I remember from churches in the past, when I was a young person, they're the names of the people who opened their houses to me to give me hospitality when I was all on my own in a new city. I think hospitality, we don't win this by an argument. We win back the importance of the body by demonstrating the importance of the body in various ways. And I think one of the most delightful is hospitality. It's one of the qualifications for eldership. And I think elders are merely to be aspirational paradigms for every Christian. So I think when Paul says that an elder should be given to hospitality, he's really saying everybody should aspire to be given to hospitality. And I think that's going to be very, very important.
I really like that. I'd like to go further a bit on that. I've got one more question. I think you might want to then ask something and then wrap up. But I think it's interesting and challenging here. You're saying you don't win this with an argument, and I obviously agree. I think all the stuff you're saying about embodiment and hospitality particularly really resonates. But within the context of being obviously you've served as a pastor, within the context of preaching, within the context of just sharing the gospel with people in the community, whether it's conversation, preaching, evangelism, that sort of thing, how have you seen or how have you used some of the stuff that you've researched, and how does it come to the surface, if you like, in those sorts of conversations?
Right. Yeah, it's a very good question, Andrew. I think in a couple of ways. I think I've been very gratified, saddened in some ways, but gratified by a lot of the correspondence I've had as a result of the books from people whose families have been badly damaged by the sexual revolution in one way or another. But one of the notes that's come through consistently in the letters and the emails I've received is that the narrative has helped them understand why their son, daughter, brother, sister, wife, husband is thinking and acting the way they do. I think a big shift, maybe it's a generational shift, but for my generation, really, sex was all about behavior. And I think the realization that sex is much deeper than behavior, that for a rising generation, it's also about identity. I think that's pastorally useful because, you can preach against the behavior. But what you've really got to do, I think, is address the question of anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being? And I think that has two advantages to it. One, the obvious advantage is I think you're actually addressing the problem people are struggling with. But secondly, it also enables you to avoid the problem of always presenting a negative vision. Yeah, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, you mustn't feel this way. Instead, what you're doing is saying, do you know what it really means to be a human being? It means X. And this is the positive vision. And by implication, Y and Z become problematic at that point. And we need to talk about Y and Z. But what we're really looking for here is somebody being truly fulfilled as a human being. And I would say, for example, one thing that I've been focusing on with the students at Grove when I talk to them, and I make this a theme in my classes now, is friendship. We live in a world where, hey, if you have strong feelings for somebody of the same sex, age 12 or 13, the only category you're given to understand that is same-sex attraction. You're gay, you're lesbian. I want to say no. When I was growing up, we had another category, the category of friendship, that allowed you to articulate your passionate feelings about somebody else in a non-sexual way. And so I think that one of the things that I found that I've sort of found emerging out of my narrative is the need to realize that the issue is an anthropological one, and to start thinking about the great categories we can use that help us to capture something that the psychologized and sexualized narrative of humanity has lost. I also think it's pressed me to think as a Christian of, well, we need to teach the whole counsel of God. The real temptation at this point is to focus on the symptoms. The real temptation is to focus on abortion, focus on the sexual revolution, focus on gender. I want to say no, a teaching strategy needs to be much broader based than that. Yeah, we have these pressing issues, but we can only truly approach them as Christians if we've actually set the full framework of the whole counsel of God up in the first place. So, second thing in terms of preaching strategy, I always thought I need to be trying to cover all of the bases, not in every sermon, but I need to be thinking strategically as I preach through the year about what are the things that I'm going to be touching on. And the third thing, I guess, as my final point would be, the temptation for real discouragement at the moment is tremendous, particularly in the United States. I think the problem in the United States is that Protestant evangelicals thought they owned the country, and it's becoming patently obvious they don't own it anymore if they ever did. And the temptation then is to think something's being stolen from you, that you're powerless in the face of this act of theft, and to despair. I think the preaching of hope, the preaching of the return of Christ, the preaching of the Lamb will triumph, I think these things have to feature as well pastorally in order to make sure that people are doing what Paul points to in Colossians, not focusing so much on the things of this world, but focusing on the things of heaven.
Our podcast is called Post-Christianity, and I wonder if you feel like post-Christian is an accurate description of our moment. If so, how would you describe what post-Christian means, or do you have an alternative?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, yes. In terms of society's values, we do live in a post-Christian world. How might I sort of articulate that? I don't think that either America or Britain has ever been a Christian country in terms of every member of the population being Christian. I do think that for many centuries, though, both America and Britain had, I would say, a broad moral imagination that overlapped with, comported with, was consistent with Christianity in terms of its public morality. I think we now live in a world where the moral imagination of the world, of the societies we find ourselves in, is increasingly antithetical to the Christian moral imagination in terms of its practical, ethical, and moral implications. And to that extent, I think, post-Christian. And I think that's what's going to create the tensions in our current moment and going forward. And the way I put it to students at Grove is this: the terms of membership in society and the terms of membership in the church are increasingly antithetical to each other in a way that perhaps in the West they haven't been for maybe since Constantine. We could go back a long way on that front in the broad West. And I think that's going to create some interesting challenges for us because the old liberal model, and again, I don't want to sound too post-liberal, and I love Patrick Deneen, love his stuff, but I'm not with him in many places. But I do think the old model where religion could be safely kept in the private square is disappearing, because that model only worked when the public square, the morality of the public square and the morality of religion basically overlapped. Do you believe in the resurrection? Yes. Well, that doesn't matter. You can still be a decent member of society in 1776. Do you believe that gay marriage is legitimate? Well, that's not an opinion you can hold privately these days. That has immediate public implications, and that's where I think the post-Christianity aspect is pinching at this point.
Right, and at that stage, the difference between Christian and world becomes ever more obvious, and there are huge threats and perhaps some opportunities too, but we can process those over the course of the podcast. Carl, you've been really generous with your time. Thank you so much for joining us. The name of your two books are?
It keeps being referred to as the rise and fall of the modern self. Would that it had fallen. It's the rise and triumph of the modern self.
They're confusing you with Reggie Perrin, I think. I don't know if that joke will try.
Al Mohler's interviewed me twice, and he keeps calling it the rise and fall of the modern self, and I'm too scared of him to correct him.
Well, post-Christianity does lead to post-humanism, so there's a kind of...
Yes. And Strange New World, which is the abbreviated version that you could read when you're on the tube heading into London on a morning.
Yes, and people can catch up with your work at First Things and elsewhere online as well. But yeah, wonderful. Carl Trueman, thank you so much for joining us.
So much, Carl.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant.
Thanks. Great to see you guys again.
Gosh, what did you make of that?
Yeah, it's obviously as fascinating as ever. I think Carl's interesting on pretty much anything you hear him on. I think there were a number of things that struck me. I think I was interested in the thing about complicity. I think I was interested in how he would approach that question, because I think one of the things I've thought about is, even when thinking through, and I specifically asked about the sort of sexual and racial politics of our moment, that the way in which the church has been complicit in some of those divides, racial injustice being a very obvious example, but to be honest, it's true sexually as well. And I think, obviously, I'm not saying he's denying that, but that wasn't the way he took the question and went. So I thought that was interesting just to reflect on a little bit. I think the most interesting thing that I hadn't really thought about before was the sort of when he framed the triangle where he's got Trueman and Pallier and Pinker.
Right.
And of course, I thought you could do exactly the same thing. I was thinking in the 18th century, I wish I'd thought of that, because actually that's just what you would get if you were to get John Newton and Rousseau or Voltaire and then the Marquis de Sade and have a dialogue, not in, actually Pallier is quite a fan of Marquis de Sade in various ways, but we're not trying to attribute everything of him to her, but thinking that is actually that way of, when we talk about the darkness of humanity, these two agree against this one. When we talk about is there a God, these two agree against that one. That was a really interesting way of framing it. So that was probably the thing he said, because I've read a lot of his and we've talked before, but I found that I've not heard him say that and found that a very interesting way of thinking. And then I guess, the fact that without really being asked, he lent into embodiment as the key apologetic response. I mean, he wasn't using that language, but if you said, what do you do about this? Right. Before we even asked him, he was really leaning into, friendship, bodies, homes, church, friendship, hospitality, church. Yeah. And I thought much that I would probably expect him to say that and believe it. I thought that was a really interesting answer, and that effectively the arguments and the more cerebral side, which we do still need to engage with, hence much of what we're doing in this podcast and much of what I'm sure we will talk about later with Rebecca McLaughlin. I think where Carl was going early on, I imagine she will agree with this as well, is that it's got to work in homes and around meal tables and in churches. And I thought that was a great response. What about you? What did you pick up?
Oh, lots of great stuff. I mean, hearing how Rousseau's anthropology was sort of divergent from the Christian story, as that's the new thing, and that's why he's interesting as a starting point. I thought, that suddenly made sense in terms of, because in terms of all the positives of Rousseau, and he was absolutely clear that there are many positives to having a sense of the individual and a sense of your feelings and all that kind of stuff is great. But what's interesting is now what's different with Rousseau and the denial of original sin and that sense of anthropology that made a lot of sense, and bringing in the issues of the material, the technology, industrialization, and that is absolutely part of the story. Even if it's not a prominent part of the book, it's absolutely a part of the story. But then I loved the way he was saying that helping people understand the being nature of your sexuality rather than the behavior nature of your sexuality, and giving people a map on which they can say, you are here, and this is why it feels the way that it feels. And I just think that's so important when I think traditionally Christians are thinking, well, this is the Bible, and everything that is not biblical is simply a kind of a fall from biblical teaching, whereas what he's saying is, no, here is an alternative cosmos, right? And you can find yourself on the map in this alternative cosmos that actually doesn't have it's not just not biblical. It's not just fallen from a Christian vision. It has a different center of gravity and it orbits around different kind of vital values. And when you inhabit that universe, you start to understand why it feels the way it feels.
Yes.
To be in a sexualized culture that we're in, and so that's the great value of the genealogy of ideas, I guess.
Yes, it is. I wish I'd asked him. Get
him back.
All the time. Yeah, but because one of the, as you know, like so in the chapter I do on romanticism in my 1776 book, I have four. Stop in four cities basically, or towns, and look at Weimar and look at the Sturm und Drang, and then look at Rousseau and talk about the sexual revolution in London taking place. But I start in Venice with Giacomo Casanova. And I realized, and I wish I'd asked him about this, because I think he is the first person really to narrate the story of his life with his sexuality as the primary point of interest. I don't think, I mean, clearly other people had talked about, Augustine did, other people have talked about sexual challenges but it's very, very minor really as a subset of a much larger, even though we quoted a lot, it's a very small part of a book that's primarily about other things. Whereas when you read Casanova, and you do get this, Rousseau talks a lot, of course, about his sexual struggles, but I feel like Casanova is probably the first person to say the main thing that's interesting about me is my sexual escapades and sexuality and reflection on them. And then now, as you say, in that, when it comes to the you are here, now going, wow, 250 years on, that was almost unique. Like no one had almost ever done that before.
Right.
Maybe, I mean, you could argue whether it's Casanova, Rousseau, or someone else comes first. But whereas now you come forward and you think it's almost assumed that the most interesting thing you could say about somebody would be their sexuality. And if you watch a movie about someone that didn't explore their sexual side at all, you would think, well, that's just. It would feel, even to a Christian probably, and certainly to most people who aren't, would feel like a very strange omission. You'd think something's missing. Why didn't they get into his marriage? Or why didn't her struggles with this relationship she had in the past come into the story? You'd think it was odd. And it's just realised that, again, as a sort of putting people on the map, saying, yeah, this is not... I'm not even necessarily wholeheartedly condemning that fact. I'm simply making you aware of it so that you can know this is why you find it hard to think about identity without reference to sexuality.
So that's the R in your weirder, or it's the second R in your weirder. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic is the Joseph Henrich thing. You've added E and R. E is ex-Christian in your book, and R is romantic. So just give us a sense of who the romantics are.
Well, so I probably the way I would introduce it. I mentioned those four cities I visit in the chapter on it because I'm starting in 1776. But really, that's the sort of the beginnings of the stirrings. I think Romanticism, in its full blown sense, really kicks in the 1790s, and it's incredibly hard to describe. You know, Isaiah Berlin writes 800 words on it and goes, I'm still not going to tell you exactly to define it, but I'm still not going to tell you what I think it is. And so I think, well, this is foolhardy to try and do it myself. But there is a combination of different emphases that are often not just expressed philosophically, but particularly artistically, musically, in the visual arts and in poetry and literature. Things like, I use a lot of alliteration for it, but inwardness and interiority, a sense of innocence, a very high, someone like William Blake, very high, almost a fetishization of childhood and innocence, a sense of ineffability and infinity, which I think are the idea that you just can't, the greatest things in life can't be owned or held or described. They need to be sort of conjured up. Imagination, the idea that what we're really trying to do is to sort of dream and pull that things from within us, and that art is basically the overflow of powerful feelings, is that sort of idea that there's a sort of intensity of emotion and feeling which ought to be expressed. And it's really a reaction, there's many other things we could say about it, but it's basically a reaction to the fear that, it's interesting, now you think of the French as being the very romantic and experimental, but at the time it was actually the Germans really saying of the French in the early years, the French have sort of, and the Enlightenment are dividing everything up, categorizing everything.
Rational,
here's these encyclopedias and the sort of structures, and actually they're just destroying that which makes life passionate and powerful. I suppose a modern, it's Robin Williams' character in Dead Poets Society is a sort of, is a not contemporary, but a contemporary-ish movie that's trying to go, that's what a romantic is. It's someone who's saying you can't boil everything down and tidy everything up.
Right.
But describing it is very difficult, and that's part of the point. But obviously it's been massively influential in the way we understand the relationship between the self and the inner person and where truth is found.
Yes.
So obviously Carl goes into this in his book, and I do in mine, that the idea that really what comes within needs to be brought out rather than you need to align yourself to the constraints provided by the world. The romantic impulse is more of a, no, I'm going to bubble up from within, and I'm going to take on that world, and I'm going to, wrestle with it. And of course, on many of them, I'm going to valorize suicide or another way of escaping it. I'm going to do something completely out there and just leave the world and go and become an oddball, which is what Rousseau does, or I'm going to write about suicide or perhaps even kill myself. Would be one way of saying, oh, it's me against the world, and the world might not like it, in which case catastrophic consequences may follow. And it was almost quite a sort of a holding up of that as an ideal. Yes. So it's a very strange movement, but you just see it everywhere. The Disney story ultimately is, I've got to find out who I am in here, and then project that out into the world
and break free from
because
and
that is a very Rousseauist idea that the world is providing, society is corrupt and it's shackling me, and the true me needs to break out and rip, and that is pretty much the plot of most novels and movies.
Yes, and it resonates so strongly with the human heart nowadays that, of course, my identity is found by looking in here, rather than to looking around at culture and family, or looking up to what God or the gods might say. And it's second nature to us now.
Yeah, you do you, be who you are. You just got to look at, follow your heart, all those sorts of things, which are trite, but they do reflect the way, not just our generation, but have for multiple generations, think about what is good and what self-actualization is and where happiness is found. And it's very foundational to who we are. And I just think we need to track that. So I want to tell that story as well as telling the post-Christian story that we've been exploring in more detail, because I think the two run in parallel tracks, and the fusion between them is catalyzed by the technological and the sort of material developments we talked about as well. So they're all happening together, which makes it very difficult to separate out just the romantic ideals and say, we'll deal with those on their own. So no, that's bled into the way we understand Christianity, which has bled into what those values are in the first place, and they've both been bound up together with inventions and maps and stuff.
And one interesting interplay of the two, on our podcast here at Speak Life, we once played a game, and it was, can you guess whether this is a coming out story or a Christian testimony?
Oh, really?
And so we went online, and Thomas,
see where that goes.
who was here, so it would just take a couple of sentences from somebody's testimony, and like he would read out the sentences from a Christian testimony, and myself and Nate Morganluck would have to think, is that a coming out story about, I used to be repressed and I used to be like this and I used to be in the darkness and now I'm coming into the light. It was an impossible game to play. We
I can quite believe it.
We got it as wrong as we did right. And romanticism and the church, it's a two-way street.
Can we come back to that in another episode? Because I want to talk about John Newton and hymns and the response of the church, and how much of what you've just described is a good thing and how much of it is a bad thing, and how much of it is contextual and how much is capitulating. And I would really like to talk a bit about that.
I love a cliffhanger. So if you want more, if you want John Newton and both the opportunities and the threats of that sort of inward turn, and come back for more of post-Christianity. So please do give us a rating and review on your podcatcher of choice. Please do share us around on social media. Sharing is caring, and do come back as we talk more about
just your inane catchphrases.
They just come out. I don't know. If you prick me, I bleed inanity. That's me. But that'll do us for now. You come for the Truman, you stay for the inanity. But we will see you next time on Post Christianity. Bye bye.